Nothing could have prepared Farmer Hans for what was about to happen that day. It wasn't often that something different happened on his farm, so everyone was in complete shock when it did. He had found something on his farm that he had never seen before. Hans, his wife Bonnie, and their daughters Mary and Giselle were silent. They looked at the plantation, which had been full of corn a week before that day. What had happened? The field was now lifeless, devoid of corn. Instead of corn, there were eggs scattered everywhere. They looked like they were almost ready to hatch. But Hans decided he would destroy them with a tractor when his daughters intervened. The girls jumped in front of the tractor and didn't want to move. They could not believe how their father could be so insensitive and destroy these living beings that were about to be born. To calm his daughters down, Hans suggested something that completely shocked them. Well, let's explain it from the beginning. Life on the farm is full of routine. You wake up before dawn and you start your work. Your days are filled with hard work, but it's always very rewarding work. Being a farmer had always been Hans's dream, and now that it had come true, nothing could go wrong. Or so he thought. Hans has 2 daughters, Mary and Giselle, with his wife Bonnie. They live on a farm where they grow vegetables, such as corn, and they also own a flock of sheep. It's a simple life, and it's not normal for anything out of the ordinary to happen. So you can imagine Hans's surprise when he woke up that morning. Hans woke up as he did every day, very early, and put on his overalls. He always let his wife sleep a little longer than he did. She usually prepares breakfast for the family so that they can eat as soon as they wake up. Hans was about to go feed his animals when he was interrupted by something strange. While Hans was in the kitchen, he heard a strange noise coming from outside. It was still dark, so he couldn't see where the strange sound was coming from, but he had never heard anything like that before. It gave you a strange feeling. He stood in the kitchen, listening, when something terrified him. It was his wife, Bonnie. She crept up behind him and leaned against his shoulder. Hans let out a high-pitched little scream. They laughed at that, but Hans was not happy. He was about to go outside to see what the noise was, but now he had to stop. Suddenly, his 2 daughters also came downstairs. "Where's Mommy? Is she okay? We heard her screaming," his daughters said. Hans looked at his wife and they all smiled. It felt like it was about to be a normal day, but they didn't know what was going on out there. When everyone finished their breakfast, it was finally time for Hans to go out and feed his animals. He had buckets of feed ready, and he walked over to the chicken coop. His chickens acted differently than usual. They walked around the coop, and they looked like they were afraid of something. But what was it? Hans then noticed something else. There was a chicken missing from the coop. Where could it be? He was looking for it, and then he stopped when he saw a small pile of feathers on the floor. "This can't be good," he thought. Hans knew exactly what this meant. He ran inside to get a towel and a box so he could put the dead chicken there. How could it have died so suddenly? There was nothing wrong with this chicken yesterday. And how was it out of the coop? He continued his rounds and he approached the pigs. They were making louder sounds than usual. He fed the pigs, and then they were quiet again for a brief minute. But Hans knew something strange was going on, and soon he would find out what it was. Then, suddenly, he heard that strange sound again. He listened carefully, but he couldn't tell where it was coming from. It couldn't be far away because you could hear it clearly. He'd never heard that sound before. It almost sounded like an animal, but what kind of animal could it be? After feeding all his animals, he went into the barn to prepare his tractor. This was harvest day on his crops, and he would start with the corn. So he started the tractor and he opened the barn doors, not knowing what was going on under the tractor. He was about to leave when he heard a loud scream. It was Mary. "Dad, stop! There's something on the ground near the tractor!" She was very scared. She pointed to the tractor wheels, and as soon as she saw it, she was scared. A sick kitten was on the ground in front of one of the tractor wheels. Hans would have run over the poor animal if his daughter hadn't seen it. The kitten had strange bleeding marks on his ears, and he was clearly malnourished. Normally, Hans's days took place on autopilot and was monotonous, but this day was hectic. He must have fought with another cat in the barn, he thought. But they're so friendly, he thought then. Before he could even think in his head about what had happened, his other daughter, Giselle, came running out of the house. "Daddy, you have to see this in the cornfield," she shouted. He was already on his way to the cornfield, but he definitely wasn't ready for a big surprise. Hans got back on his tractor and drove into the field. The place was just on the other side of his house, so it wasn't too far away. He noticed small white dots in the distance, but he couldn't tell what they were until he got closer. But what was in the cornfield? He got out of his tractor, and Giselle ran to him. "What is this, Dad?" she asked. Hans wished he could answer her, but he was as puzzled as she was. "Where's all the corn?" Mary and Bonnie also ran to the field and stood there with their mouths agape. "Eggs?" Bonnie asked, stunned. "How is this possible?" She was about to answer, but then she heard the same strange sound. It had been coming from the country all this time. He crouched down, and he held his head close to one of the eggs. Then he jumped, startled. There was something in there. Mary and Giselle looked at the eggs, and they cocked their heads as well, listening intently. It looked like the eggs were almost ready to hatch. But Hans wanted to get rid of them, so he got on his tractor to pass over them. That's when his girls moved forward. They jumped in front of the tractor and refused to move. Hans then gave up on the idea, but he did suggest something to calm his daughters that completely surprised them. "Well, girls, we don't have a crop anymore, but maybe we can still save the eggs," he related. The girls' faces lit up and they jumped for joy. But they had to figure out how to keep all 20 eggs warm at once. Hans was afraid something would happen to the eggs if they moved them, so he had an idea. He suggested that they put a large black canvas on the eggs. This way, they'd be dry if it started to rain, and the canvas would keep them warm in the sun. The girls were excited about the plan, and they ran to the barn to get a canvas. But Bonnie wasn't as excited as the girls. She looked worriedly at all the eggs and wondered what animal they came from and how they got there. What if they were snake eggs? She didn't want to hurt any animals, but she couldn't raise snakes either. Hans noticed his wife's concerns and soon said, "They look like chicken eggs to me. You've got nothing to worry about." His reassuring words left Bonnie with even more questions. Soon after, her daughters returned with a large black canvas. Together, they stretched the canvas over the eggs and placed stones on the ends to hold it up. Back to work. Hans told his daughters to work very carefully because breaking those eggs is the last thing he wants. But his daughters were inseparable from the eggs. They kept their eggs all day while Hans finished his activities. At the end of the day, Hans had to promise that after dinner they'd have dessert so that they'd want to go home. The next morning, Hans woke up to a strange noise, but it was not the same as yesterday. He ran to the window and looked out at the field. You've got to be kidding me. What he had thought was true. His daughters had woken up before him and had gone to the eggs. "It's 4 o'clock in the morning," Hans said loudly, waking his wife. "What's going on, honey?" he asked. But then he heard laughter. Bonnie rushed out of bed and down the stairs. She was carrying the first thing she saw. "I knew those eggs were something bad. This is not how we raise our daughters," Bonnie muttered, looking at Hans. Bonnie just hoped that nothing bad had happened to them. Giselle and Mary's smiles faded as they watched their angry mother approaching. It was still pretty dark outside, so they knew they'd done something wrong, but they just wanted to look at the eggs. They were their babies. But was there something weird about those eggs? But as soon as Bonnie saw what the girls were doing, her anger turned to fear. Giselle and Mary had carried straw and hay from the barn to the eggs and had built a little nest around each of them. This was not something that Bonnie would expect from her daughters. This melted Bonnie's heart. And instead of shouting, she praised her daughters for taking such good care of the eggs. "These girls will be excellent schoolchildren in the future," Hans told his wife. Hans especially could not have been prouder of his daughters. But this moment of happiness quickly changed after hearing a peeling sound. Suddenly, they heard a thunderous cracking sound. The girls jumped in shock, thinking they'd crushed one of them, but it was something else. They were taking such good care of those eggs that they now thought that something was going to come out of the egg. Giselle looked closely at one of the eggs, and she noticed a big crack in its shell. She cried with joy and held it up for Mary to see. "Look, sister, it's almost time!" But the little girl reacted in a totally different way, which no one understood. No one expected the way Mary would react. Instead of being happy, she was very sad, and she started crying. She didn't want her eggs to break. She was too little to understand what was really going on, so her mother tried to explain everything to her in the best possible way. Bonnie tried to explain the cycle of life, but to no avail. So she took Mary inside to help her take care of the sick kitten. The kitten had to be fed all the time, so it worked. But Hans still had no idea what might be inside those eggs. It had been 2 days since they found the eggs. The canvas had done an excellent job of keeping the eggs safe from weather and predators, but they were beginning to crack, and at any moment they would begin to hatch. On the 4th day, the time had finally come. Hans went to check the eggs when he noticed that one of them was already empty. He called his daughters, and he waited for the others to hatch all together. The wait was longer than expected, and the girls had almost lost their patience when finally 2 more eggs began to move. They cracked. Slowly but surely, a small animal hatched. They had never seen anything like this before. Hans couldn't believe his eyes. Of all the animals, he never imagined that these would hatch from the eggs. He shouted for his wife to come quickly, but he could no longer contain his emotions. He couldn't help himself, and he began to cry. Bonnie asked what was wrong and pointed to the animals. Bonnie immediately knew what was going on, and she comforted her husband. However, she was also very moved to see what was coming out of those eggs. The animals were peacock cubs. Hans always took care of peacocks when he was little. He even had one, which was his best friend. After his death, he never took care of a peacock again. It seemed like a miracle. But that's not all. Hans wanted to keep all the animals, but Bonnie was against it. There wasn't enough room on the farm for 20 peacocks, so they decided to do something else. They kept 2 peacocks on their own farm, and then they took the other 18 animals to a peacock sanctuary. There, they had all the freedom they deserved and would get the best care. And the girls loved their 2 peacocks, too.